Jessica. That was just for you, Jessica. I was just sharing a private joke with my friend Jessica over here. Look, she's laughing. She's laughing her head off. Yeah, hi, everyone. Welcome. Welcome. Day 2 is done. We have a good day? Good day. Can we have a big round of applause for your amazing instructors, each and every one? Woo! Do you want to do another wave? No, I'm just kidding. No more waves. We did one. It was great. Don't want to push our luck on that one. My name is David Simpson. I'm still... What's that? Oh, you better stop really soon. Not quite yet. I'm still the program director. My pronouns are he, him. Bathrooms are still down the hall. We may have some, are there any cushions left? There are some cushions left, but they are proving popular, are they not? Can we have a big round of applause for the cushions? Ooh, I'm getting a bit punchy here, so as you may be able to tell. We have a great event for you tonight. We're really glad you're here. We have poet Jessica Jacobs and artist Paul Stopforth. It's going to be a wonderful event. Before we get started, though, a couple of other things. You know, the bathrooms I mentioned, there's still a water thing down the hall for filling your water bottles. We still have assisted listening devices. If that would help you improve the quality of your experience this evening, just check with Sarah and Hannah. Again, big round of applause for Hannah for thinking of iced coffee. I'll stop really soon, I promise. All right. Jessica will be signing books at the back after the event, and her books and other faculty from this week's books are for sale at the back of the room, along with some great merch. A new design of a t-shirt that I'm very fond of, so check it out. It's the gray one. It's terrific. I wish somebody was back there to hold one up, but that's okay. I'll be okay. I'm fine. No, it's all right. Oh, okay, go ahead. Hold it up. Isn't that awesome? That is so pretty. It's got a quill and a paintbrush because, you know, writing, visual arts, when you put those two together, it's very sharp and they're going fast. So don't get up now. Wait till after the event. Tell me to stop. I will, and I will. Okay. Big hand to East End Books for continuing to manage our bookstore, and to our lovely sponsors, the Arts Foundation of Cape Cod and the Cape Cod 5 Foundation, who so generously support our summer public programming. I have to applaud. They watch on the live stream, so we have to, you know, say the right thing. So, and that's about it. I'm going to ask you once again to turn off your cell phones if you haven't already, so you're not that person who's like fumbling in their bag in the middle of the event, going, fuck, I got to find the phone. And then, so I'm going to get myself off the stage before I do any lasting damage. And then to introduce Jessica, I'm going to invite one of her students to the stage to introduce her. Please welcome Pamela Butler to the stage.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Yes, okay, great. Okay, so as soon as I saw Jessica Jacobs' workshop, Service of the Heart, Exploring the Sacred Through Poetry, I knew this was exactly what I wanted. I wanted to explore my spirituality and sense of the sacred, to become easier writing about devotion and connecting with it. So Jessica Jacobs is the author of Unalone, Poems in Conversation with the Book of Genesis, and Take Me With You Wherever You're Going, one of Library Journal's best poetry books of the year, and winner of the Devil's Kitchen and Goldie Awards. Her debut collection, Pelvis with Distance, which I love the title, a biography and poems of Georgia O'Keeffe, won the New Mexico Book Award in Poetry, was an over-the-rainbow selection by the American Library Association, and a finalist for the Lambda Literary and Julie Suk Awards. Her chapbook, In Whatever Light Left to Us, was published by Sibling Rivalry Press. she co-authored Write It, a collection of writing prompts from Spruce Books. Jacobs is the founder and executive director of Yetzirah. I hope I say that the right way. Okay, Yetzirah, a hearth for Jewish poetry. And I just think this is an amazing example of how much she gives back to the community. And Yetzirah is a nonprofit organization, literary organization, dedicated to fostering and supporting a community space for Jewish poets. And it was inspired by organizations like Cave Canem and Kundeman. So Jacobs holds an MFA from Purdue University, where she served as the editor-in-chief of Sycamore Review, and a BA from Smith College. Her poetry, essays, and fiction have appeared in publications including Orion, Plowshares, Image, and New England Review. She leads workshops around the country, teaching for programs, including, of course, here at Fine Arts Work Center, which I'm really grateful for personally. UNC Wilmington's MFA program, and writing workshops in Greece, and serves on the North Carolina Writers Network Board of Trustees. So personally, Jessica's book, Unalone, spoke to me just so powerfully, and I think the minute I got it, I just sort of inhaled the whole thing, and it's just so intelligent and full of grace and humanity and beauty. She explores the book of Genesis and is in conversation with this ancient text. She gives voice to women who have not been heard, like Noah's wife, who beseeches him to let her brother and mother in the ark. And in one of my favorite poems in the book, Jessica brings the text into the present day, writing about a young woman helping to lay pallets of grass on a lawn and seeing the connections that are made. Burton Vysotsky writes, like our matriarch Sarah, the Torah's first poet, Jessica Jacobs opens the book of Genesis to her readers like a gate with an easy latch and well-oiled hinges. Joy Layden writes, lost Edens and losing a parent, love and marriage, climate change, what it means for a human being to be a conduit for the divine. These are only a few of the subjects Unalone addresses, seriously and sensuously. So Jessica's journey for me has been an inspiring and compelling one to learn about. To write her first book of poetry about George O'Keeffe, she said in an interview that she holed up for a month in a small primitive cabin 30 miles from the nearest town. She said, I wanted to understand what inspired George O'Keeffe to live like this and what gave her the strength to do it, to see it through. And that being alone for such a long time was one of the most difficult things I've done. And she said that she had gained a renewed sense of spirituality, which we clearly see in her work. I converted to Judaism about 7 years ago, and while I loved learning about the Torah from my teacher, who was a man, I really missed hearing a female perspective. One of his favorite sayings was, if you make an effort as small as the eye of a needle, God will make an opening as large as a horse and buggy, an opening large enough for a horse and buggy to drive through. I messed up the quote. So this workshop with Jessica is like finding the opening that I've been searching for. So thank you, Jessica. And it is a pleasure to introduce you.
It's God calling. We're just, we're having a special experience. Pamela, thank you. That was so beautiful. Let's thank David and his punchiness. Thank you very much. Yes. Let's hear it for the cushions. Thank you, Sarah and Sharon. And y'all always have the best interns, too, Hannah and Fatima, and iced coffee. This is glorious. I was so inspired by Joanne's talk yesterday when she spoke of her time in the Dune Shacks, that I was just going to read poems, hopefully to you, not at you. But I'd actually like to talk to you a little bit about my process of writing and how I came to write a book in conversation with the book of Genesis, which right about the time, Pamela, when you converted, it was when I started reading Torah for the first time. So I certainly never thought I would I would find myself here reading poems that are in conversation with the Torah. And because we're all artists and writers, I always think it's good just to hear about how projects get started, right? And just because that might become a pathway in for you in some way. So for me, I had a lot of different types of jobs, and at 30, had the wise idea to quit a well-paying corporate job to become a poet. Yeah. Thank you. And so I went to get my MFA in Indiana. Good God, I left Manhattan for Indiana. It was a little sad, and I could not write to save my life. So I spent a lot of time looking at art because I was looking for inspiration. And I went to the Indianapolis Museum of Art, which is an amazing free museum, but I don't know, I just didn't see anything that really moved me. And then walking out, I saw this. And it's not very big. It's, I think, 24 by 30. And it was painted over 70 years before I had seen it. But it's called Pelvis with Distance. And it's by Georgia O'Keeffe. And even though I had not been writing at all up to that point, I couldn't help myself. I stood on the spot and wrote an entire poem, which is not generally my process. And I became fascinated by how this young, inspired woman became this incredibly wise elder. And I actually have this in my kitchen. So I cook with Georgia a lot, this other image. And for the next 7 months, I devoted myself to reading everything I could find that she'd ever written. I read 3 biographies of her, and I traveled as much as I could around the country to go see her art in person. It's very flat when it's as a print, but just the depth when you're seeing it and you can see the brushstrokes is amazing. And I had no idea why. But I trusted that there was something in this obsession, right? And Joanne, you spoke about instinct, right? I trusted that there was something in that instinct that was leading me, even if I didn't know where it was going to lead me or why I felt this desire, this need. And I began to write poems in the voice of Georgia O'Keeffe. And I had lived in New York, so I could write about her years in New York, but I didn't know what the desert was like. And I think that there's often the common misconception that as writers, we write from the neck up, right? We write with our brains. That's great. I hope we engage our brains at some point. But I believe that we write through our bodies. And so for me to write the desert, I had to go to the desert. So that's Rocco. So Rocco and I headed out. We went past Santa Fe, past Ghost Ranch, and we just kept going 25 miles down this dirt road. That's Rocco. He was very friendly. And eventually, I parked at a little farmhouse, and I was driven 5 miles to a cabin. And Pamela, like you said, it was about 25, 30 miles from the next nearest town in Abiquiu. And that's where I stayed for a month. So there was no electricity, there was no cell phone service, and there was no internet. So there was really no way to communicate. If I needed something, I would have to walk or run to the farmhouse that was 5 miles away. Right, yeah, it was interesting. What is not pictured is the pink porcelain toilet on a platform with no walls, because why do you need walls? No one's gonna see you. Yeah, and everything, water is in a cistern. I had a solar charger for my laptop. That was the only electricity. And that was the view. Wow, right? It was this beautiful canyon. And it was amazing. And I ended up, writing a poem a day, which was, I'm a very slow writer. I spent a lot of time reading in weird positions, apparently. I made friends with hummingbirds who accidentally would get trapped in the cabin. And I spent a lot of time on the deck. That was where I did most of my work. And I also found ways to structure my time, which I think is very, very helpful when you're in a place of solitude, right? You have to have routines, and that's actually something that the Desert Fathers talk about a lot. And so for me, one of my routines was actually, Sarah showed me I have a laser pointer. That is a mirror. I covered all of the mirrors. I became really interested in the idea of what would happen if the only looking I did was from an interior eye, and I wasn't looking at myself like in an exterior way, which was intense. And then I began to make a calendar of items that I found. So this was kind of the calendar of my days, and I would pick one item every day. I would go running or hiking, usually along deer runs or cattle trails and all of that. And eventually I realized that why I was there, why I was compelled to write this book, was that I wanted to know what it meant to be an artist. And I wanted to know what it meant to be a woman who was self-possessed, like Georgia was self-possessed. And eventually to come to like she's someone I feel like who like owns her face. Like if you look at that older woman, right? Like I wanted to know how to grow into that. But first, I had to learn how to be alone. So I'm just going to read you a poem from very early on. So this is the book that I ended up writing. This is actually O'Keeffe's Throat, which I love this image. It was taken by her husband, Alfred Stieglitz. And most of the poems in this book are in the voice of O'Keeffe, but there's a series of prose poems written about my time out in the canyon. And this is one of the early ones. In the canyon, too, fear breaking. Sun lavas over the cliff lip into my first full canyon day, while I watch from the marsh of residual night. When put in touch with the priest who lived here for each of the last 3 Octobers, I'd written to ask how much food to bring, what other supplies. She'd replied with 2 questions. What is your experience with solitude? How are you girding yourself for this time? At a sound like a Cessna, I turn to see only a hummingbird. Pressure builds in my chest. I've felt this before, but only when confined in a cave's crawl length in a crowded tent. But here, nothing but space, but air, for me, for a month alone. Knowing the root of anxiety is anxere, to be without breath, I inhale, I try. But breath is a strangler fig, a rib cage tourniquet. My hands and feet grow honeycombed, carbonated. The dog barks at something only he can see. I ache for a return to bed, for the child's comfort of sheets overhead. If I can't see this day, it can't see me. Rifling books at random, I find God at creation poured light into vessels. Unable to contain it, they shattered and fell. Tikkun olam. Jews gather these shards to repair the world. But there was a second shattering, a second type of repair. Tikkun hanafesh, repair of the soul. Inherent in brokenness is breaking open, the ability to hold more than when whole. How much will I hold when this is over? Thank you. So what I held by the end were a lot of questions. That is what I had. And I think there are very few times in our world where we are alone like this. I didn't have Netflix. I couldn't just put on a podcast. I had to actually feel my feels, as my younger students like to say, and it was terrifying, right? Like you can hear kind of the fear in that. But I also found myself asking like these big existential questions, like what does it mean to live a good life, right? How can you be in service to more than just yourself? And when I returned to the world, literature, which up to that point had felt like the closest thing I had to a religion, I was raised in a very secular Jewish home, it felt thin. And I really wanted to connect to a wisdom that was more ancient and more tested, which is when I began reading Torah for the first time and engaging with other religious traditions and trying to really learn from just this deep time, right, and connect with something beyond the immediate. And that led me to then spend, the next 7 years really immersed in these texts and write the book Unalone. And I'm going to read you some of those poems. But I didn't think these poems would ever get published because it just seemed so strange to me to write, in conversation with big religious questions, which I think like in this world in which we like often value irony and cleverness, I was writing these poems because I can't really understand something until I write about it, right? And I'm delighted that the book is in the world, but the reason that I had to write this was because I wanted my poems to change, right? And I think we write who we are, so I had to change who I was. And these poems and the study really helped me do that. But first, I will read you the first and only poem in which the word penis appears in my life. Because this very strange thing happened. I know, we just took a quick turn. The super strange thing happened because I was reading the Torah and I was like, how is this ancient text like speaking to me, right? Like no matter what I was thinking about, it seemed to talk to it. And then I was here and I was on Herring Cove and there were all the ladies. And I went running to the gentleman's beach and I was like, oh, this is like an Orthodox service in which... Yeah, so the only Hebrew word you need to know in this poem is mechitza, which is the cloth that separates the men and women in Orthodox service. So, and you should also know that there's a very lovely euphemism that is used in the Torah, which is that men used to actually cup each other's genitals to make promises. There's research. I'm not making this up. But translators say they put their hand under the person's thigh. Yeah, so there's a quote from Genesis. And Abraham said to his servant, "Put your hand, pray, under my thigh, that I might make you swear by the Lord." It's pretty sexy, Genesis. All right. I apologize in advance for offending everyone here. Okay. Saturday services at the Provincetown shore. Just off the parking lot, the lesbians come prepared. Our section, a series of small encampments fortified with tents, coolers, canvas chairs, and the occasional baby under a pop-up sunshade. A sunscreen-slathered dealer shuffles cards onto a folding table. But down along mechitza of pebbled sand, the masters of minimalism. Men with little more than flip-flops and hand towels. Oceanfront anthropologist, trespasser between tribes, I jog past. Note how the sculpted V's of their backs arrow to an outcropping of asses polished as tumbled stones. They're so pretty. At the shoreline, a man flips into a handstand, penis flapping like a windsock in low breeze. Inverted Michelangelo until his scan for admirers unkilters him into the surf. A seagull skims out, wings slow clapping the water. Behind me, the land of women gripping beer koozies, fanning themselves with hands of Texas Hold'em. I'll return, I'm required. All my stuff is still there. And yes, men can make a bit much of their manhood. Family jewels, third leg, second brain. But the trappings of, we can laugh at poetry, it's okay. But the trappings of comfort can obscure unadorned need, and for just this barefoot mile, I let myself envy their economy, the premium they place on desire. 2 by 2 men enter the dunes. Because anyone taking an oath, said Rashi, must hold in their hand a sacred object, and because circumcision was Abraham's first commandment and came to him through suffering and was beloved, to him he chose it as the object on which his servant swore. For these moments they share, no matter what Leviticus says, pursing tight its prurient verses. These men, too, are taking a kind of oath. Our bodies are all we entail. Thank you. All right, that was the high. We're going to go down now. So the other thing that I found very helpful in this study is this idea, even though, of course, the Bible has been used to do much damage in the world to many people, is approaching a text as though it's sacred, approaching a text as though it is without flaw. And when you do that, I, as a literary student, was taught to be snarky and dismiss things, right, and to find flaw in it. When you approach something like it's sacred, it means that if you cannot find something of value in it, that's on you, right? And you have to sit with it until it becomes your teacher, which sucks. It's so hard. Like it's painful, and I'm seeing my students do it, and I have such respect for you because you're sitting with the hard things. We're going to be immersed in mortality tomorrow. That's our topic. So I offer this poem because for me, the hardest story was the binding of Isaac. No matter how long I sat with that, I couldn't make sense of it, right? And there are all these rabbis and they're trying to explain it. But I think it's a really beautiful way to explore what happens when we believe in something without asking questions. And I think right now we are constantly being asked to take stands and make absolute statements without nuance. And that seems very, very dangerous to me. So I became fascinated in this idea of what might happen if we admit that we don't know, right? And that we approach the world with curiosity instead of just having to be reactive. And this poem opens with a quote from the philosopher Erich Hofer. Absolute faith corrupts as absolutely as absolute power. Why there is no Hebrew word for obey. What came later was the real trial, because God knew Isaac would not die, while Abraham climbed the mountain believing he would. With conviction tempered in the fires of his faith, he walked up through the shaded valley, his son resolute ahead on the trail. Behind them, Sarah, Isaac's mother, Abraham's wife, a small darkness in the distance, growing forever smaller. He bound his beloved son, pulled back his legs, wrenched back his arms, knotted his ankles to his wrists, and laid him on that altar like a child falling through the sky. He held the knife, knowing from every animal he'd ever sacrificed how his son would jerk and shudder when the blade opened his throat. The familiar smoke of offered flesh. What came later, even with Isaac alive in the fields inside Abraham, was the knowledge of what he'd been willing to do. When they passed in the tent, Isaac rubbed a remembered ache in his shoulder and never again held his father's eye. Sarah, smelling the imagined ashes on her husband's fingers, the blood in the crease of his throat, turned from him in the night. And on every path Abraham walked from that day forward, his son as he had been, a small back barely the span of his hand, slung with the kindling meant for his burning. Seconds from the slaughter of the one meant to carry his line, of the son he'd wanted all his life, who's to say the voice in his head was God? Judaism is not a faith, but a tradition. And isn't doubt the crux of conscience? Yet what came later on a Sabbath morning, centuries on, was a congregation in Pittsburgh reading this story of Isaac's binding, of Abraham's terrible bind, when a man burning with unquestioning belief entered with a gun, and with no better angel to stay his hand, opened fire, believing the death of Jews would keep our country safe, believing this massacre, elderly congregants bleeding out on the floor, was God's work. Who would call such actions holy? And how many more times will each of us come down from the mountain, conviction knocking like a knife in our belt loop, stained with all we would have done? My daily gods are minor ones, of pride, of lust, of impatience and complacency. Yet how many have I harmed on the way to what I thought was right? Or, with hindsight, on the way to what I wanted? And how many sorry sacrifices have I made of myself? What if we turn from certainty and arm ourselves instead with questions? Obey, obey, obey is everywhere in translation. The real word is Shema, listen. Thank you. I also found, just like with O'Keeffe, where I was able to write about these desires which felt too difficult to put in my own voice, right? This crazy idea that I could be a poet, I could be an artist, I could put it in her voice, right? And that kind of felt safer for a while. And I often find that having something to look at that's a little outside myself lets me write about something that might feel too difficult if I'm just holding it close. And for me, about 8 years ago, my mother was diagnosed with what eventually has become Alzheimer's. And being able to write about that, and I'm sure many of you find this in your writing and your art making, that being able to put something difficult in your art allows you to kind of put down a little bit of that weight. So I was very grateful to have this text to be in conversation with. How long before? To move in the wet heat of Florida summer is to be carried in the mouth of an animal. But inside my parents' house, kept chill as a mausoleum, my mother paces and weeps in a ragged nightgown she refuses to change, her hands two anxious dishcloths trying to wring themselves dry. Because I am not the person I'd like to be, I shut the door on this, on my father's poor job of pretending not to cry. And between fences draped in air potato vines, beetle-eaten to a path of tattered valentines, run as though I could leave any of this behind. as Joseph tried to when he named his first son Manasseh, he who makes forgetting, a word that hints at memory evaporating like water from a sizzling street, that heat hungry as the silverfish swimming my childhood books, leaving holes in all the old stories. But to name someone after what you say you've forgotten is to make of them a neon arrow to the relentless past, one you'll someday return to. This is not that. The mother I've lost is lost for good. The only cure for such decay is its completion, when she's forgotten even forgetting. In the mountains, I've made my home, vine barrens of kudzu, invasive as her illness, mask every gall, burl, and blight. So come, high climber, you foot a night vine. May all her buried memories remain for her unmarked, unnamed. Cover it all with your nullifying green. Be a sea that waves over everything. And if it brings her peace, let her forget even me. Thank you. I will tell you a joke afterward, I promise. All right, this last poem at least has a happy title, so we'll start high. Mazel tov. See, yeah, woo. Thank you. So Mazel tov, and I just want to say, and I think Joanne, you spoke to it so beautifully, and Portia, you talked about your lineage and looking at ancestry. Find your subject matter, find your dune shack, your desert. Find the place that can inspire you and give you space to explore something. Because even if you don't know why you're compelled to do it, it can change you, right? And then hopefully you can create something that maybe you can hand to someone else and can companion them in some way. So, Mazel tov. Circular breather, my dog can whine without ceasing. His tail thumping the wall beside the bed to call me up and out to the yard instead. In moonlight, the hydrangea's white blossoms are a zodiac of branch-bound constellations. Once God called Abraham out from his tent to the open field to count the uncountable lights in the sky, promising offspring bountiful as dust, numerous as the stars. Like Abraham, I too left my land, my birthplace, my father's house. But the closest I have to offspring is lifting his leg at the azalea. Nose busy with the news the night air brings. Mazel tov, we say at births and other joyous occasions, the Jewish go-to for congratulations. Yet tov means good, and mazel, constellation or destiny. And sometimes, like Abraham, you must leave the place that grew you to grow toward better stars. In the house, my love is sleeping. Along the fence top, a procession of possums reminds that even in darkness, there are those who can see. Above, trees thick with summer frame a porthole of sky. Maybe, though, it's not always the stars that matter, but the space between them. The lines we draw to shape the absence, the lives we forge around what goes missing. So if I wish you Mazel tov, know what all mean is. May you live beneath good stars and find a reason to open your door to the night. From the deck, the cool breeze makes a festival of the silver-lit leaves. Under my palm, the warmth of his fur, the rise of his ribs. he doesn't suspect his kidneys are failing, that his muzzle is white as the winter the vet has said he will not live to see. Like all of us, he is dying. Like most of us, he doesn't know it. His chin on my leg, he trusts me with the weight of his head. May the darkness be as much a blessing as the stars. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. Can we have one more big round of applause for Jessica Jacobs and her beautiful poetry? And thanks to Pamela for that great introduction. Before I invite Paul Stopforth to the stage, I just want to let everybody know that Paul will be showing some of his earlier work, which includes images of the body of Steve Biko, who was an anti-apartheid activist who was killed in South Africa by the South African police. So just want to let you know that there are images that are difficult, just to let you know. And if you find yourself uncomfortable at any point, it's perfectly okay to get up and leave and come back when you feel comfortable to do so. I also want to let you know that Paul currently has an exhibit up at the Schoolhouse Gallery in the East End, and it's on view until August 6th. So I would, if I were you, I would take a run down Commercial Ave to the Schoolhouse Gallery to see his exhibit. It's really wonderful. And now I'd like to invite one of Paul's students to introduce Paul. Please welcome to the stage Marjorie Gans.
All working? Yes? Okay, good. Yeah, gonna watch the time. I am really happy to do this, and I'm gonna start by talking about Paul Stopforth's bio, and so you have all that important information, and then I'm gonna babble on within time about my own experience. So early in his career, Paul Stopforth created bodies of work that were startling in their courageous engagement with the repressive society in which he lived. Invited to be an artist in residence at Tufts University, Stopforth left South Africa for the United States in the late 1980s, despairing that there would ever be change in his country. So he came to this country. Over the course of his career, he has held numerous one-person exhibitions both in South Africa and in the US, and has been the recipient of numerous awards and residencies. Public collections holding his works include the Harvard Film Archive, the Constitutional Court of South Africa, Tufts University Gallery, the National Gallery, Cape Town, Johannesburg Art Gallery, Durban Art Museum, the Pretoria Art Gallery, and the University of Witwatersrand, if I pronounced that right, or close, art galleries. He taught in the Visual and Environmental Studies Department at Harvard for 10 years and the School of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, Mass College of Art and Design, and at the Provincetown Fine Arts Work Center. He is represented by the Schoolhouse Gallery in Provincetown, which I want to echo what David said. It is a wonderful exhibit. It's an exhibit where you will get to see such beautiful draftsmanship and a capturing, just a capturing of a place and people in a way that's got such a powerful use of color. It's as if the color is almost what speaks as well as the shapes. And so that you connect with these men's bodies and with the place in a way that kind of invites you into history, but it's an invitation, and in some ways, this possible painful one for sure, but it's not righteous, it's not preachy, it's this real invitation. So please go to the Schoolhouse Gallery. I first took a course with Paul a number of years ago, and as I've said a bunch of times this week, I am not an artist, and I'm happy to not be an artist because then I don't feel pressure to be an artist. And it was billed as a drawing course, and I thought, oh, goody, I'll go in and I'll learn to draw. And by Monday night, I was so sort of overwhelmed by everything. There were things on the floor, there were materials, and I just went home and thought, I gotta pack up and go, because I'm not an artist. And then I thought, well, that's ridiculous, because I paid for the B&B, and I paid for the course, and besides, who cares? I mean, who cares whether, because I'm not an artist. And so I went back, and I had this wonderful week, and it was wonderful, I would have to say, as much for Paul's kindness as anything else. And this is my third time back, and when I was going through my materials to get ready to come here, I found these pieces of work that I had done in the last one. And it was like, who did this? I don't have this in me. I didn't, but I remember doing it. And alternatively today, I was painting something and I thought, I hate this. I can't stand this. And walked out because he said, go take a walk if you need to. Went out, took a walk, came back. I still didn't like it. But I suddenly thought, well, but that's okay. I don't have to like it. I can do something else on this big piece of paper. And I think that that's what I want to say about Paul is, one, he's incredibly kind, and it's more than that. It's a kind of generosity that I was just thinking, it sort of lets you make mistakes without failing. You can't fail. It's about doing experiments. And long ago, when I was doing my dissertation and got no results, somebody said, yes, but isn't that great? You got no results. Isn't that fascinating? I felt less that way trying to get my doctoral degree, but I always remembered that because that's what this is. Everything is a surprise, an experiment, and a conversation between you and your art, between you and the materials, between somebody else, and I've just never done anything like it. Taken a lot of courses in my life, but not quite like this, so it just makes me happy, and that's it.
Thank you, Marjorie. Marjorie said when she informed me she would be giving me the honor of providing the intro, she said I might cry, so I hope I don't. And I said, well, I hope I don't. Because that was lovely, thank you. Before I begin, I would just like to once again thank the Fine Art Work Center, David, Sarah, everybody concerned, everybody involved, Sharon, of course. I think this is possibly my 10th teaching week here. It might even be more. But it's been one of the pleasures of my life to be in this place so consistently over so many years. And the other thing that's extraordinary is when I first came here, the screen was on that side. There were large pillars which you had to kind of arrange to make sure you didn't sit in front of one. And obviously it worked, but this has raised just the presence of the place to an extraordinary degree, as has the courtyard. And depending on the nature of your needs, the elevator helps a lot as well. So thank you. Thank you, Provincetown. Thank you, the Fine Art Work Center. My wife and I were very fortunate to be introduced to Provincetown soon after we arrived, 30-some years ago, by two close friends who also were immigrants a lot earlier than us from South Africa. And it's been the one place where I think we've felt a real connection. In fact, some of the work that hopefully I'll point to is based on Robben Island, which is the island on which Nelson Mandela, along with many other political prisoners, was imprisoned, and the breakwater. So I've done a series of paintings which relate directly to a pool called Bethesda. And Bethesda, biblically, is a pool in Jerusalem in which Jesus healed people. And I think it's a true pool. I mean, this actually existed. So Bethesda, at the southernmost tip of the African continent, is where I was fortunate to spend 2 weeks as an artist in residence, not, thank God, as a political prisoner. And the distance, or rather the connection for me, was when seeing and walking the breakwater. And I felt what I needed to do, which I did in some work, was to provide a link between, or a bridge, between the southernmost tip of the African continent and the tip of this particular Provincetown peninsula. Yeah, that's kind of it for the intro, I think. I do have something to say about a penis, which Yuvi and I were discussing a little earlier today, as she too is a South African compatriot connection. But I woke up this morning and thought how to begin the South African section. And where's the arrow? Oh, there it is. Sorry. This is on a slope, so sorry, guys. Okay, now what I want to do is to move it up. Sorry? It's okay. I think I can deal with it. Except I can't. Okay. I mean, we just. Anybody tell me how to slide this up? There are a number of images below this that I want to lift up. Any suggestions? Any young person who knows how to handle these things?
You can press this down.
Oh,
You can
there are two little arrows, up and down. Thank you very much, Anna. Thank you. Oh, and I can see it on the screen too. I don't. Okay. I often, when I go to a lecture and the people presenting don't get it right, I think, for God's sake, why didn't you spend half an hour with the techies to make sure that you knew how to handle it? Well, I did. And I still end up. Okay, so I woke up thinking, how am I going to introduce these? And this is relevant here at the moment, too, unfortunately, and has been for a while. And it's Friedrich Nietzsche. Whoever fights monsters should see to it that in the process he does not become a monster. And if you gaze long enough into an abyss, the abyss will gaze back into you. So I began working. Sorry, I can do this here. In the 1970s, with what was happening in South Africa politically. Now, the landscape in South Africa is superb. But it seemed to me what was profoundly most important was a history of exploitation, racism, ongoing violence towards black people. And I began under the influence of Rauschenberg, but Rauschenberg is very much about the pleasure of the street. I went looking for the kinds of materials and images that reflected a whole other and rather horrifying reality, called Bill of White Rights. Okay. And I'm just going to move through these fairly quickly. I moved after living on the east coast of the country for a number of years. I moved back to Johannesburg, which is where I come from, and with two friends of mine, opened a gallery called in a multicultural space that was a fairly radical breakthrough in the context of South Africa, in that black people and white people could, within certain limits, engage with each other, perform on stage, eat together. One of the terrifying things of the many crimes of the apartheid regime was the denial of our shared humanity. And of course, that's what's happened here since 2016. And Robert Reich, I haven't read the article, but the title of an article that I saw recently was The Politics of Joy. And although this doesn't mean that it's predictable, but all of a sudden, there's this real pleasure, that this level of engagement, this awareness of possibility. And I thought Politics of Joy is, after the abyss that we've all been staring at, is a fabulous way of describing this present moment in time. So thank you, Robert Reich. Opened this gallery in Johannesburg, where I had done research into deaths in detention. This figure referring to somebody who, while in police custody, fell down stairs and killed himself. A position where persons forced to, on tiptoe, lean up against a wall and for anything up to 18 hours at a time. A young imam who was thrown from the top of the police station called John Vorster Square. So anyway, this was an alternative space, obviously. And at this time too, concerning the death of Steve Bantubiko while in the hands of the security police, discovered a technique of drawing which is incredibly labor intensive. And I used it to, in this case, draw 3 portraits of the men who were responsible for Steve's death. And I was given, through my connection with a lawyer who was working on behalf of the Biko family, he gave me access, which was not allowed to, I mean, it was illegal for him to have done so, but he gave me access to the photographs of Steve's body and the details of hands and feet that accompanied that terrifying situation. And I finally completed a large drawing, 8 by 5 feet, of Steve's body. And it's the piece which is in the National Museum actually it's in Durban, not in Cape Town. So looking into the abyss became necessary, I felt, in terms of what I wanted to say about being there at this abysmal time. And what the security police began to do, because increasingly the so-called liberal media, as well as international human rights groups, were looking into the treatment of prisoners. And what the police were doing, instead of taking people into police stations, they were taking them to isolated beaches and abandoned buildings to torture them there. So I began a series of drawings in which I'd photographed a couple of abandoned mine buildings and placed people within them. I was also becoming increasingly aware of, I mean, people often drew parallels between the Nazi regime and the fascism, essentially, of the South African. I began looking for images from the Holocaust, and this man here is extracted from some, okay, he's gone, but the Warsaw Uprising. And I just wanted to show you, here's the leader. So, you know, they're all the same, aren't they? Wherever they happen to be, they all look like this. In fact, there was an early, okay. My website is online. I was very fortunate to exchange work with a remarkable website designer, and she exchanged the website for work. So, okay. America. My wife, Carol, had spent a number of years living in England, in France, in South Africa. She traveled extensively, and I was invited, as Marjorie said, to be artist in residence at Tufts. And it was a brief stay, but we went to live in Paris in an artist studio for a few months, and then it was time to go back to the dreaded home. And there was no indication that change would ever take place. And Carol felt that although there were obviously problems in America, that of all the countries she lived in, that as a woman, America was, and particularly, I guess, Massachusetts, was the place where she felt women had opportunities that, and a kind of respect that didn't exist in any of the other countries that she'd lived in. So we came here, and this is a self-portrait of me. Come on. Okay, I'm going to go to the colonial couple. Yeah, it's fine, don't worry, thanks. The colonial couple is a particular type of English-speaking white South African who has, in the very distant past, some link to England, but they still act as if they're subjects of the Queen. They see themselves as superior to everybody else, and they are the most conservative, perhaps the most boring group of people I've ever come across. And you can see them. I mean, you know exactly what they look like if any of you have watched English movies that deal with this kind of... I think many of them continue to try and live in India after the British left, but they certainly are a particular type. And I would have been referred to, somewhat insultingly, as a sout pil by Afrikaners in South Africa. And a sout pil is somebody who's got one foot in South Africa and the other foot in England, and his penis hangs in the sea. So salt penis is what I was called on occasion. And I struggled to find a connection, because leaving there, leaving history, leaving family, leaving friends, leaving geography, leaving everything behind, and coming here. And of course, I knew America really well from the movies. But when you get here, it is definitely not the same thing. So I spent the first 2 years in therapy, and thank God for therapy. But what I became really interested in were Aboriginal Dreamtime paintings. And I started doing a series, this being the first one, which is called Dreamer. And a lot of people see this as a form of pointillism, but it's not. These are beads of color. They're not expected, in the way that Seurat did, to be placed in a way that they begin to color mix. And of course, these shapes here are horseshoe crabs, which there's no such thing in South Africa. The seas are much too aggressive, much too wild for any creature that's well over 4 million years old to survive. So they were a real shock and a real surprise, and they're absolutely beautiful animals too. And the lizard is a Namibian, a lizard from the Namib Desert. Another one, this is called Guardian. And one of the things, if you get caught up in politics, you really are screwed imaginatively. I was a kind of second-rate Marxist. I really couldn't get my head around Das Kapital. And the men and women who were engaged with theory, I really didn't know what they were talking about. So there's a kind of limit. I mean, what these men want to do is to actually, besides the destruction that they will wreak and have to some degree already done, is to limit our imagination, limit our minds. And I was born and brought up in a country where that kind of insanity was part of my life and the lives of, and of course, particularly the lives of black people. So coming here, I started to look at things like Hinduism, Buddhism, practicing Buddhism, and realizing that the world is an extraordinarily complex and much of it very beautiful. So Guardian, the cow, is a reference to the sacred cow in Hindu mythology. And in fact, having visited India, it's not just mythology. There they are in the street. You step aside for the cows. The hand is that of a Maasai warrior, and that curved shape is a knife blade. And one of the reasons I chose the cow is, of course, the importance of cattle in African culture remains a very important aspect of the lives of people. Then came 1994, and the change, the real change. When people, we all know that things change, times change. I mean, this is going to change. What's happening here is obviously going to change. But when change takes place on that level, 300 years of, people talk about apartheid and the Afrikaners as being the villains. The British, well, the Dutch first stepped off the boat. They started it. Then the British took over, and they created most of the laws, which then were taken on by the Afrikaner government and improved, if you like, keeping us all apart. And yeah, that was the crime I wanted to refer to, that the refusal to recognize our shared humanity is one of the major crimes of the apartheid regime. And just thinking about Falk, what happens here, I think, in this kind of contained space is a recognition of our shared humanity, and that's an extraordinary thing. Okay, diviner, a reference to traditional healers, and this I painted, he's called Freedom Dancer, the South African. And I justice of the new court in South Africa came over to Boston. He was a man who had been blown up by a bomb in Mozambique, and it had taken off his arm and blinded his one eye, and he was one of the men responsible for writing the new constitution. Saw this work and arranged to have it shipped to South Africa, and it now hangs in the Constitutional Court, which that's where it belonged, and that's where it is. The other important aspect in my working life is the presence of the Schoolhouse Gallery and Mike Carroll, who for the last 20 plus years has shown my work in all its variability, I guess. Large drawing done in pastel on cloth, turning right, pointing down, and turning left. Again, African cloth and cattle, referring to my past there. And a series of sculptures, which I called Crossing. It was a time when I kind of felt the struggle between myself and my identity here and there was something that I was trying to come to terms with. I also saw it to some degree, and I should probably speak to Jessica about this, Jacob and the angel. Is he wrestling with God, or is he wrestling with himself? What is he actually wrestling with? So that's what these pieces were in fact about. And then, of course, they became somewhat formulaic, although they sold very well. And it was soon after that that I was very fortunate to be invited to teach at Harvard University, and I traveled during a summer because all the work I'd gotten while being here at this point was part-time, so I had to teach in the summers. And being at Harvard, I had summer free, or most of it anyway, and spent 2 weeks as artist in residence on Robben Island. And this is an aerial view of the island. This cruciform here is the landing strip that brings in supplies. This rectangle here is the prison center. This is the harbor where prisoners were brought from Cape Town, which is 8 miles away, across a very, very treacherous ocean. And while on the island, I found a number of things. This was, in fact, quite a valuable element that was placed in a small museum that's part of the island. It's a blanket pin, approximately 5 inches long, which had been made by a prisoner from pretty high tensile wire. And just this extraordinary thing that, we know from the literature of prison and prisoners, how they find a means to create under these extreme circumstances. So I called it Monument. It's 7 feet long, 3 feet wide. And just this notion of monuments being, white men on horses, the conquerors. I wanted to bring the idea of the monument back to the people, the ordinary guy in an extreme situation who finds the means to create. And this is what monuments should be. They shouldn't be praising people who are almost always, suspect, certainly politicians. In Nelson Mandela's cell were these steel cabinets, the kind of cheap steel cabinets that one finds in offices probably everywhere in the world. But I floated it in space, so it's kind of suspended in history. So a whole series of works that relate to Robben Island. This, again, a connection, it's called Siren Song. Listening, and I have done for many years, to a lot of blues musicians. And this is a painting of the siren above the prison in which Nelson was housed. And so many of the blues songs, of course, were written and performed by blues singers who'd often spent time in American prisons. So there's calling it Siren Song, links it to the songs here as well as to the specifics of Robben Island. Just Bethesda, that's this pool on the island where the sea comes in at high tide and fills the pool. And the color of the pool is affected by the acidic earth that's part of the land. And it forms this strange coppery color. And during a period when the island was a haven for people suffering from leprosy, they would bathe in this pool, believing that the waters would help heal their sores. So this terrific sense of connection with the earth and what the earth holds as possible. Anyway, went on and on. Oh, this is quite interesting. Looking for beauty, which I think was a question that Susanna raised, or somebody raised with Susanna last night. So the search for beauty is, to some degree, part and parcel of these paintings. And yeah, again, looking for what's possibly beautiful. This blue cape is a reference to an item of clothing as well as, of course, to this cape. The rains came, and one of the first one I did, which is Sundays in Savannah. I'm sure it's performed by many people, but Nina Simone's rendering of it, cover of it, is quite beautiful. Then for a brief period, playing with portraits again. Oh, this guy, I thought he's the kind of son that the colonial couple would have. Okay, yeah. And this was quite interesting. 2016, where you know who became president. No man's land. This kind of sulfurous landscape. This strange, nightmarish figure. This basilisk staring up at us, and this guy trying to escape. And then I'm just prior to the plague, I moved my studio from a space that I shared to a much smaller space, a monkish kind of cell. It's about 5 foot square. And these are small, obviously black and white images. And bodies of men. I wanted to work with the male body, not unclothed, but clothed. And at the same time, I wanted to remove a means of identifying race. Because as soon as you see a face, all the kinds of ideas, issues, associations, prejudices come into play. So removing the face and focusing on the body became a very interesting level of engagement for me. And they're taken directly from photographs, which often contain a much larger number of people, but isolating and pulling out specifics was the purpose of this body of work. And softened them a bit more recently with this pink and this guy with a blue frame. This guy with a blue frame too. And then more recently, and some of these works are up at the Schoolhouse. These are small paintings. They're 16 by 16 inches. Men at Work, Sherpa, Gulag. Didn't quite work, but anyway, it's always worth trying. Gumshoe, Undercover, and one of the most recent ones called Fallout. And having read recently and seen that rather remarkable movie series on one of the television stations called Chernobyl, and of course COVID, and the fear that was obvious and necessary around that whole period, and putting these figures engaged in, again, something that's somewhat mysterious, but nonetheless does reflect, I guess, my connection, my curiosity with what's happening in the present and how it can be translated in some way. What I began to think about was, because the work is so varied, is that it's more like a journal or a notebook, that something interests me, something that I'm curious about takes me away from, is this part of the history of painting? It's not about that. It's about curiosity. It's about interest. It's about engaging with something which I believe is relevant to me in the present. And that is that. So thank you all very much. Yeah, just grab my water.
Okay, can we have another big round of applause for Paul Stopforth? Wonderful presentation, and thanks also to Marjorie for your wonderful introduction. And yes, now we're going to do a little Q&A with the audience. Remember that we are live streaming this event, so if you have a question, please wait for Hannah or Sarah to come to you with a microphone so our viewers at home can hear your question. And with that, does anybody have any questions for our presenters?
Jessica, thank you for your beautiful work. And I'm so sorry about Rocco. Oh,
Thank you.
that's why I can't keep dogs. But my question goes back. There are so many questions, but I want to just start with a nuts and bolts thing. As you started in your presentation, you were in New York with some hotshot job, which you left.
Yes.
Had you already started to write? Because you said, I didn't know if I could be a writer. Were you already writing?
I had always written as a young person, and then I had this idea that I had to have like a big kid office job to prove myself.
Of course.
So I had come back to writing, and that's when I realized my life felt really empty. And the things I loved best were when I was in some type of teaching position, and when I was writing. So.
Did you? And I admire you for taking that leap and then go to the desert, to remove yourself. Did you find any parallels between the canyons of New York with their glass and steel and the canyons out west with their stone and their sand? To me, it's still a canyon.
Yeah, and actually, there's a poem in the new book of running on Wall Street, and kind of like how it feels like a canyon, and it both traps heat and then also like it doesn't allow. It's very cold depending upon the season. Yeah, I'm always. I think that as just anyone who's kind of paying attention, like I make associations a lot. And so every landscape I've ever been in seems like it's recalled by the new landscape. And then it's always interesting to kind of put those things in juxtaposition with each other. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Oh, and that custom about grabbing the genitals of the men, that was a custom in Rome too, because that showed that you weren't hiding anything, and you trusted him implicitly because he didn't do this.
I'm glad some things carry over. So.
Thanks for that detail. Any other questions?
This is for Paul, and it's just a matter of curiosity because I don't paint. But you said you've been doing your recent work, these 16 by 16 canvases, and their experiments. And how long does it take you to paint a 16 by 16, a body of man?
It's 16 inches, right?
Yeah, well, that's what you said, I thought.
Yeah, it probably takes a couple of weeks.
David wants to use the microphone.
Maybe 30 hours altogether. 30 hours altogether? Yeah. It does vary to some degree, but yeah, I'd say that's approximately the time. Yeah.
My question is going to be overview for both of you, and it has to do with you're each responding to your world. You're responding personally, and you're responding to your politics, and you're responding to with Philadelphia and with Biko, and you're making work that feels very universal. I look at it and you're not telling me everything. That's what poetry does. What good painting does is it kind of suggests, and how do I get into that? And I'm wondering, do you consciously avoid the superliteral?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think it's a great question, and I think I'm conscious of doing it, but to say it outright, yes. It's got to be more than somehow. And then so-called literal paintings are often some of the most beautiful paintings anywhere. But I guess it's the time too. I don't know who, somebody said it, a poet, they always do. Time being out of joint. And so I can't sit down. I know a lot of people do. They'll paint the beauties of the Provincetown beach or beautiful landscapes. And I think that Andrew Wyeth is a superb painter there. But you've got to be able to do that. And I just feel out of joint, I guess. So it's necessary for me to do something that kind of eats a little, that's got a kind of edge to it, that's difficult to chew. Doesn't go down easy. Because I don't think any of it does. I mean, life, So.
Well, I also think that, you have to give me a little something so that it hurts me a little bit. Do you know what I mean? That I know that it's Biko, that I know that it's somebody who came in and, shot up some people. Like, I relate to that. But also, if you're too literal, then I turn away, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So there's a seduction in the language and a seduction in the visual language that I think it seems to me to be integral.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think that being as, looking as closely as you can, and when I say looking, I actually mean sensing with your entire body. I think that, bringing as many, grounding things in the senses as much as you can is very powerful. It's a way that we communicate when we're trying to communicate something, instead of just giving flat observation, report details. But I think what I've found is I want to see something and try to render it so specifically, which then causes me to make it strange in some way, like to look at it so closely it becomes strange. But I feel like that's one half of it, and that's where I'm really fascinated with metaphor, both in visual art and in writing, is because then I think when you take that very real thing and you put it in conversation with something else, it creates a field of space between it, and that's an invitation for mystery, and it's an invitation for a reader or a viewer. Yeah, so that's something I think about a lot. And also it's like, makes it fun to observe the whole world because you get all these beautiful new metaphors and they're just waiting for that thing you're going to pair it with in some way. Yeah.
You made some reference to how you work, or that you don't work fast, but you didn't really talk about how you do work. So I'm really curious, especially in terms of this body of work that's in conversation, like text study, you know, if you could just talk about that a little bit.
Well, as Hannah told me, I'm kind of extra, so yeah. She's not wrong. Yeah, so for me, I want to immerse myself in something until I don't have to think about it anymore. Because I think like whether it was with, I'm looking up like there's a slide, whether it was researching O'Keeffe's life and modernist art and all of these things, or delving into Torah and rabbinic writing, I think you can get constrained by what I think of as the straitjacket of facts. But I think if you can take something into the point where you metabolize it and it becomes a part of you, then it can come out in interesting ways. And so for me, how I do that, like with, I mean, I won't go super into the weeds, but with Genesis, it's divided into portions. And so I would just immerse myself portion by portion. I would read like 3 or 4 different translations. I taught myself biblical Hebrew very badly, but so I could engage with the text directly. And then I would read classical rabbinic writing, but also contemporary scholarship, and then other writers and artists responding. And as I read, I was always trying to stay alive to what questions and resistances came up in me, and also what memories. And I would kind of write those things in the margins of my notes, and oftentimes that marginalia would then become the seed of the poem I'd eventually write. So in some ways it was very controlled, but I also tried to always make space for mystery, let each poem take the form it needed to, and then I revised like hell. Yeah, so it's a lot of work. And some of these poems took years to get to a final form. So. Thank you for asking.
Do you want a question? No, I didn't.
I don't want to hog, but I do have more questions. I don't want to take up time. But, so one thing that strikes me about seeing both of you together is both of you are really, Paul's been reading us poetry, and he's been giving us things to hold as we paint, you know? And your collection for your calendar, like, that was beautiful, you know, and that was so, that was, you know, you're both artists in this kind of more broad sense, I would say. And I'm wondering about that. And also, both of you are really interested in the body experience, you know, the idea that this is a visceral thing that happens in your recognition of what it is you're, you know, responding to, I guess. And the idea of mystery and surprise comes up. So those are just notes that I just made, and I'm just like, discuss.
Would you like to discuss mystery?
Oh, the other thing was, you know, Jesus and the Torah and like all this, I mean, big stuff's coming up here.
Yeah, sure. What was the question?
There isn't one. It's just a comment.
I guess this putting oneself in a position of risk is, I think, I mean, all of you that are working in my class at the moment are all risking yourselves. And I think what is fabulous about it is the courage to do that is, I think, for me, it gives me such pleasure to be with people who've, it's very different with younger students, with people who've experienced the world in certain ways and are willing to let go of the confines of their lives, willing to step into a space and explore, not knowing the outcome. And for me, it becomes a pleasure because I don't know the outcome either. So when the work begins to become visible and people step back and say, well, I hate it, I say, that's fine. To hate it is absolutely fine. The point is to carry on doing it. And I kind of feel that certainly in South Africa, and again with I'm sorry, Uncle Carl, but with the kind of emphasis that Marxism had on the lives of people within the liberal realm, which is the one that I to a degree occupy, that anything that smacked of spirituality, religion, religion is the opium, it's anathema. So this kind of crushing of ideology, which I think you mentioned in a slightly different way, obey. You obey on the left and you obey on the right. It's not as if going left is going to save you from authority. It's not. And then finding, along with therapy, that meditation became a source of being present in the world. And both my wife and I began getting quite deeply involved with Buddhist practice. She more than me because she's a more spiritually intelligent person than I am, but I think women are. Certainly the teachers that I've met through Buddhism, the women teachers are the one who make the real sense to me. Pema Chodron is an obvious example. And I think also that mystery is endless too, that it ends when you end. That if you think you've solved the problem or found the solution, you haven't. And I think that's what she and I, in our involvement with Buddhism, reached a point where it seemed to be necessary for us to believe in reincarnation. No, I'm also a materialist, obviously. So meditation becomes the ongoing mystery, which is directly involved with our own minds and our own bodies. How do we do this? How do we act as human beings? What are we? I have no idea. And the older I get, it becomes even more confusing. So I think mystery is again a way of keeping buoyant, of keeping, yeah.
Yeah, and I think something that I really admire looking through your body of work is you seem like you're always reaching for something and that you're always trying something new. And to me, that's a way of staying in mystery. Yeah. So it's like that everything's still in conversation, but you're kind of always pushing yourself. And so I think that's something that really interests me is like I want each book to kind of try to approach something in a new way, and to push myself and kind of stay in that flow state where it's like you're at the edge of your ability in some way. So.
And I was saying to Jessica a little earlier, what I love about poets is that you can write, as Mark Doty does, about a crab shell, and then he can write about a painting, and then he can write about a tree, and then he can write about the relationship with his partner. And painters tend to sort of remain in a kind of groove. We've been talking in our class referring to the Israeli philosopher, intellectual Yuval Noah Harari, and how he talks about stories, that stories are essential, that everything is made up of stories. And that I find particularly with poets, and less so with painters. Some of the most boring people I've met are painters. Some of the most interesting people I've met are poets.
I paid him to say that.
Yeah, thanks. Great question. Thank you. Sorry, I didn't use this. Did it matter? Could you all hear me? Just for the people at home. Okay. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much to both of you for sharing your art with us and with the world. I was wondering if you could speak to a conflict that I'm curious about, which is that the artist is the mouthpiece for humanity. And also, I'm wondering if it's come up in you a hesitance to be a mouthpiece for a story that might not be your own. And I know that might be like a contemporary way of looking at art. So I was wondering if that's ever been a tension for you, and if so, how have you confronted it and still remained creative? Thank you.
I mean, I think, yes, definitely. Thank you for that question, Allison. Yeah, I think that's a tension that I deal with a lot. I mean, I'm writing persona poetry. I'm taking on other people's stories. I guess the thing that I've come to is, I mean, fiction writers are able to write lives far, from their own. And I think that there's real value from trying to, through an imaginative lens, as much as you can viscerally understand someone else's experience. I mean, if I were just to write about my own life, that's so small, right? It's so small. And so to me, for me personally, that's where research comes in. And that's where like doing the work. And then it's also, I think, a question of intention, right? And really interrogating, like I'm always asking myself, like, why am I doing this? Am I doing this to make myself look better, look smarter, whatever? And if that's there, if I can sense that, I want to revise that out of the poem in some way. I want to ask real questions, a lot of times questions that I do not have answers for. And then there's a really beautiful Catholic idea of kenosis, which is a self-emptying. And that's something that I think with meditation is part of that. I'm very interested in how I can be as sound of a conduit as possible for what I'm finding, because I feel like I'm engaging with something that is far bigger and far smarter and more profound than I am, and just trying as much as I can to let that kind of move through what I'm writing.
The question arose when, with regard to the Stephen Biko works, and it was a question that's been raised only recently, and I was contacted by an art historian academic in South Africa, and he said, what right did you have to take on Steve's martyrdom in the way that you did? And I said, well, I knew Steve. And so as I was, a friend of his, I felt that I had the right to talk about his life and his death. And the guy said, yes, of course. But I don't know, I mean, the question for me is if I'd said, I felt so moved by it, that it was such a significant life, brought horribly to an end. If I'd chosen to do so because I understood that, would I somehow now be pilloried for having taken on this particular story? And it kind of worries me to think that I would have. It would have not been acceptable if I didn't know Steve, because I did know him, it was. Are we not allowed to empathize, sympathize, understand, recognize the suffering of others? And it's a difficult question, I think. But fortunately, I don't have to answer it for myself any longer. Yeah.
All right, let's have another round of applause for Paul Stopforth and Jessica Jacobs.
Thank you.
We have one more faculty event tomorrow night with Andrew Mockler, Melissa Wilkinson, and John Murillo. So be sure to come back here tomorrow at 5. Check out the gallery if you haven't done so. It's a wonderful exhibition in there, our summer show. We'll be signing books at the back of the room, and come back tomorrow night. Thank you. Have a great night.
Yeah, I can't get out of the thing though.